Okay, so hello everyone. I have to pick up the place between being in the camera or seeing you guys. So I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to stay here, but hopefully I can catch up some of your faces. Thanks for coming. I hope that you are enjoying the conference and you are not too angry. So hopefully you can wait for a couple of more minutes. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been talking to many conferences in the past, but so far for the last couple of years, thanks COVID, I've been a bit far away from conferences. So it's you know me getting back to the stage. Just to get a taste of who I have in the room. Is there any Spring users? Yep. Okay. Quarkus or Java EE users? No. Okay, perfect. Whatever you are, Spring users or Quarkus user, doesn't make really much difference. Everyone is really impacted by the namespace change. Before starting, just a few words. My name is Jean-Louis Monteiro, and I come from France, as you mentioned, with my accent. I've been working for Tommy Tribe for about a decade now. Tommy Tribe is a company founded in 2012, and our goal is to support open source projects such as Tomcat, Tommy, ActiveMQ, and so on. So we do provide many things like support, TV, patching, and all that stuff. I'm a long-time open source contributor on the Apache Software Foundation and more recently at the Eclipse Foundation. And that's probably the reason why I'm here today. I've been working quite a lot over the last few years, delivering Jakarta IE9, Jakarta IE10, and now working on Jakarta IE11. So we'll get into more details a bit later. I'm not living in the castle, by the way. I'm I'm in the Loire Valley, which is a famous river in France, and a famous area where basically you have all the castles, and that's the reason why I've got this one. I love this one because just behind it there is the former Da Vinci house as well, which now is a museum. So that's just a side note. All right, let's get started. So what are we going to see today? So we are going to speak about the Javax to Jakarta migration or transition. Who is familiar with the Javax to Jakarta migration? Yeah, probably all of you. We'll have a look to why we've got into this situation. A bit of history and understand all the challenges and the impacts, especially on the security side of things with the CV patching, for instance. And then I'll give you some tips on how to migrate your applications and how to deal with libraries, dependencies, especially if you are using Maven, where you don't really always know where the dependencies come from, but you still have to migrate them because otherwise it won't work really. And the last part is going to be more on sharing, which is basically on your company. There is basically no chance that you're going to be migrating everything at once. So you might end up by having like a transition period where you're going to have to cope with Javax and Jakarta-based applications or libraries. So the last part is more on giving you some tips on how we're going to be able to share some libraries with other teams in the same organization. A few words about the story. So I was explaining to you that a few years ago, it's actually the 5th anniversary. Oracle decided to open source the Java EE platform as a whole. Obviously, Oracle just gave the platform, but say, well, you cannot use it or you cannot update it. Otherwise, you have to change the namespace basically, because Oracle just gave all the sources but decided to keep the IP on the JavaX namespace. So obviously it doesn't work because when we got the source at the Eclipse Foundation, we wanted to just add new features on JPA, on JAX-RS, on JSON, and therefore it wasn't sustainable to stay on the JavaX namespace. So as a community, we decided to go and move from Javax to Jakarta. It was back in 2019 when we received all the Java EE platform. The first thing that we did in 2019 was to release the first version of Jakarta E8, which is actually the exact same content, version. Everything is similar to Java E8. Actually, it was more for the Eclipse Foundation to really get used to the release process, run all the TCK, the test compatibility kit, to make sure that we would be able to certify the application servers or the implementations. We started really with Jakarta E9 to move all the source code into Jakarta. So in terms of content, Jakarta E9 is again similar to Jakarta E8. The only big change is the switch from Javax to Jakarta namespace. At that time, we had a few options. The first one, which is the one we use, was to update all the specifications to Jakarta. And the other options were like hybrid, like let's migrate to Jakarta only the specifications we're gonna upgrade and keep the ones that we don't touch into JavaX. But then we realized that it would be a nightmare for organizations and companies to handle that switch over the years. So we decided to go big bang and change everything into Jakarta E9. A few months ago, we've got Jakarta E10 with a set of new features, and Jakarta E11 will be published very soon with also a large set of new specifications, like Spring Data like specification, new Jax-RS specific features, CDI, etc. So really, it took basically 5 years, I think, or 8 years to go from Java E5 to Java E8, and in the last 5 years we did basically 4 releases of Jakarta, and we decided in Jakarta to basically follow the LTS cadence of the JVM, which means that we're gonna be doing like far more releases than in the past, and have a platform which is hopefully providing more features, and hopefully which is also more time to market, if I may. In terms of what's impacted, pretty much everything. As you can see, from batch to concurrency or Jax-RS to Jax-WS, everything that you may use in your applications is converted from JavaX to Jakarta. So even if you use Jax-RS with JSON-P, or if you use transactions or mail, you're going to be impacted, and you're going to have to cope with the transition from JavaX to Jakarta. So if we want to be complete, we can use this slide to have a look to what's not affected by the Jakarta namespace, because obviously it would be too simple to say like everything has been converted to Jakarta. In reality, Oracle, even if it gave a couple of APIs to Jakarta, decided to still keep the ownership of some of the specifications and packages that you can see on the screen. So there are a few of low-level APIs such as JMX, GNDI, or low-level XML APIs, but I would say that only if you are writing an Hello World application, and therefore you might not need any of those APIs, but if you are a Spring user, you are most likely using Spring Boot with Jax-RS endpoints, and therefore you are impacted by this. Maybe you deploy on Tomcat as well, or Spring Boot? Tomcat, yeah. Yeah, Tomcat today is still known to be like the most used application server. I think there are still sources that show Tomcat to be like owning still 60%, something like this, of all the runtimes. So it's running basically pretty much half of all the Java applications in the world. So, and Tomcat obviously implements WebSockets, servlets, and JSPs, so Tomcat is also impacted. Let's move on a bit. yeah, in the entire Java history, I think that's the biggest breaking change in the platform, and therefore it's the biggest change in the industry because it impacts everybody, as we have seen previously. Why it's important, as I mentioned previously, the release cadence is going way faster with Jakarta. We are keen to add new features, like I mentioned that we have Spring Data, like we have a configuration which is coming very soon. We have NoSQL. We have light profiles. So we keep adding new things, and microprofile also helps having like new features around open tracing, open telemetry, and those kind of things which are going to be included as well in Jakarta in the future maybe. So this is one of the reasons why it's important to be having that in mind, because you won't be able to stay on Javax for quite a long time, because otherwise you're going to be just growing your code base and accumulating some technical debt. So I think you should be migrating to Jakarta as soon as possible. It's also it can also put your company at risk, because most of the open source projects, Spring included, and other open source libraries won't be able to keep up and maintain both Javax and Jakarta versions of their libraries. So if you do not upgrade to new versions, which are most likely going to be Jakarta based, you may be subject to some CV vulnerabilities. And also, as I mentioned previously, the new Java JVM release cadence requires you sometimes to upgrade your JVM, and upgrading your JVM sometimes means that you have also to upgrade the libraries because they are not compatible anymore. And those might now become also Jakarta ready and not JavaX ready. I have a few words about CVs. I don't know if you are familiar with CVs. Yeah, if you are running anything like in the health or in the payment industry, you may be compliant with HIPAA or PCI requirements, and even if not, you may be also required to keep up with CV patching, because otherwise, again, you may be at risk, like companies like Yahoo, Facebook, Alibaba or eBay. We have like tons of examples, like Equifax a few years ago just lost 200K credit card numbers, I think. If there isn't, is there anyone from Elastic in this room? Nope. I think the biggest Java breach was from Elastic a few years ago, where they basically lost 10 billion account information. So really, it doesn't really only impact PCI environments or HIPAA environments, it really impacts everyone. CV stands for Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures. It's basically a list of open breach which is maintained since 1999. They are usually rated between 0 and 10, 10 being the most critical ones. Just recently we've got Log4Shell. I don't know if you heard about this one, but this one was like a very well-known one. Yeah, this one was rated 10, I think, because it was very, very easy to reproduce and to steal accounts from there. I've got a few statistics about some well-known tools or application servers or runtimes that you may be using. There is in Tomcat, for instance, around 12 CVs every year. There is also pretty much the same number on Quarkus if you are running on Quarkus. We have Spring users, so here is Spring as well. We have a few less in Spring, not because Spring is less vulnerable, just because you have to go and pick up all the Spring modules if you want to sum them up and know the total CV for Spring. This one is just for Spring Core, which has around 4, but if you look at Spring Security, Spring Boot, Spring Data, you may have like way more CVs in your application. The JVM itself also has like between 60 and 70 CVs per year, which is quite a lot. And you know, again, you must upgrade your applications, otherwise you put your company at risk. What are the challenges now? We've seen that you know, you won't be able to stay on Javax for quite a long time because of all the reasons I mentioned previously. In terms of challenges, I've seen a couple of them, IDEs, but it isn't really a problem. All the IDEs today are already migrated to Jakarta, so there isn't really much to do in that area. Most of the work is going to be on the dependencies, especially if you are Maven users. You know, if you haven't looked at the size of your WAR file really, or looked at what Maven is pulling and dropping into your lib directory, you should definitely do now, because the more you have in there, the more issues you're gonna have and the more work you're gonna have. So if you wanna start migrating your application, you should first start by pruning all the dependencies you don't need, so you have less issues in the future. Anyways, so you're gonna have to basically migrate your source code. My experience is that migrating your source code is probably not the most difficult part, but we'll look into that later. And you have to also pick up an application server which is compliant. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find a magic recipe. I have only a couple of tools that I can share with you with the pitfalls I found, with the issues you may find as well. I can give you some tips on how to share and handle the migration, but that's the only thing I can give you, basically. The first question you may be asking yourself is, well, can I keep running my Javax application? Well, there are two options there. The first one is to pick up a Javax runtime which is still maintained and which still receives CVE patches. Tomcat just you know, published a couple of end of life you know, dates. For the moment, I think Tomcat 9 is going to be maintained for quite a long time still, but you know, I don't know for how long it's going to be, because the rule with Tomcat is just to maintain the current development version plus the two last ones. So as soon as Jakarta 11 will get published, most likely Tomcat 9 is going to be end of life. So really, that's something you have to be looking at if you want to keep running your JavaX application. The second option is like to look at the JavaX application as a black box and see if you can pick up Jakarta ready runtime and run that application in there. This is obviously possible. There are mainly two approaches you can use for that. The first one is using bytecode transformation at build time, and the other one which is at runtime. I'll just kill the runtime one. It doesn't work. It's just too slow. You know, you cannot have like full hands on how to configure it. The only one which tried this approach is Tomcat. So in Tomcat you can deploy your WAR file into, I think it webapps-java something, and it goes and basically does all the bytecode transformation and then drops the transformed WAR file into web apps and then goes with the usual deployment process. But it doesn't work because it just basically transforms half of the specifications. So if you have JPA in there, CDI or any other library, it won't work basically. The build time one works. I've used it successfully with a tool named Eclipse Transformer. This is a bytecode transformer where you can configure you know, everything, all the patterns you want to change. It works pretty well for at least simple applications. As soon as your application starts growing up and having like many dependencies, it's hard to get everything converted at once. You always find like edge cases where it doesn't work. And even though you get to convert your application, you're going to be converting a Java E8 application, which is Javax based, into Jakarta. But as I mentioned, in Jakarta E10, we introduced new APIs. We also introduced backward incompatibilities, which means that if you convert, for instance, a plain servlet application from JavaX to Jakarta, well, it might not work in Tomcat 11 because in Jakarta E10, the servlet specification decided to start pruning deprecated methods and classes. So if you use things like, let's move on, if my remote, if you use things like HTTP session context in your application, well, this class disappeared. So if you converted a WAR file and you deploy that in Tomcat 11, then it won't work anymore. And same for CDI. You can see on the screen, if you use like CDI extensions, library with CDI extensions, there used to be a parameter which is appfoo, the second one in this method, which wasn't required before and which is required now. So obviously, if you start migrating that into Quarkus, Wildfly, or into any other runtime, then it doesn't work anymore. I could find some examples for Spring Boot as well, but this is basically the same issues. If you convert some old applications into Jakarta, but you use that with new APIs on your runtimes, you may find issues because methods won't match, or class will disappear, or signatures will change. The other issue I found is when basically you have bytecode manipulation in your applications, which, well, is pretty much always the case. Everyone uses JPA, for instance. So whenever you have ASM, bcell, javasys in your WebInflib, then you might have things like this, where it's really hard with Eclipse Transformer or bytecode tools to go and catch up these packages inside, string values. So those are edge cases where basically transforming your application becomes harder. Well, if I cannot run my application with a JavaX, if I cannot transform my JavaX application to run it into a Jakarta compatible runtime, let's look at how I can transform my application now. So as I mentioned previously, converting your source code is pretty easy. If you are not too bad with grep-sed or find search replace, well, it might work very easily. I think you may have done things harder than a grep in your source code. Just mind that not all the packages got transformed, so you have to be a bit careful about your search and replace patterns. But overall, it's pretty easy to do. And also mind that whenever you're going to update the APIs, you may find issues with CDI, JAX-RS, servlets, and you may have to fix those into your source code. But again, you know your source code, you know the dependencies, so it's pretty easy to get the migration done and the small issues fixed. Where it's now harder is to deal with the dependencies, because if you start using a dependency, if it's available in Jakarta, then that's perfect, right? You should just change the dependency version, pick up the Jakarta one, and then you are done. But well, from my experience, it's not the case. Like there is always a Jackson somewhere or another dependency which has like a JavaX import in there which hasn't been converted into Jakarta, and that's where basically you start having problems. That's why I mentioned a few minutes ago that if you haven't been looking at your libraries inside your WebInflib, you should definitely do that first. It can save you some time. So if you don't have like a Jakarta version of your library, well, you have no choice. You have to convert it yourself. I've done that successfully for a couple of libraries with some issues with some others, which wanted to be helpful, like I've used Apache Johnson. Well, it's a JSON-P, implementation like Jackson, but on the Apache side. They had like a version, a Jakarta version of their library available, but they have done it in a way that if you start using it, it basically breaks all your applications, because they use the Maven Shade plugin to convert that at build time, and then they published 2 jars saying like, well, it's gonna help our users. But actually what they did is push the problem to the users. So they would rather not do anything, and instead of doing just half the work, or just push the problem to the users. I'll get into that later. My remote control may be running out of battery. I'll do it with the keyboard. And the problem becomes harder if you start basically having some other dependencies in your application, because you never know with Maven how many dependencies you're gonna get and how far you're gonna go in order to catch up all the dependencies you're gonna have to translate, basically. So what you end up by doing is basically having a flat view of all the dependencies, and then look at them and see if there is any Javax dependency in there. I think I've already mentioned all that stuff. Yeah, here are the tools I used. Thanks a lot. Yeah, it works better. Thanks. Here are the tools I used. There are a couple of them you can use on both the source code and the bytecode side. Well, if you have to update your source code, you can do that with grepsed or another tool, which is JKTA. But really, if you can do search replace in your IDE, I think you are all set. Obviously, it doesn't work with bytecode, but it's enough to change your source code. When you have to translate your application or dependencies, I've used 3 different tools for that. Not because I like them or I like to experiment many tools, just because they have their own advantages and drawbacks. The Maven Shade plugin saved my life more than once. Because if a dependency is not ready, you can just import the dependency into one other module in Maven and then configure the Shade plugin to convert it. Again, just mind that it may have other dependencies, transitive dependencies you have to convert as well. I'll show you some examples after. The Eclipse transformer works on both source code and bytecode. This is by far the most complete tool you can find in this area. It's very configurable, very flexible as well. Obviously, it's very difficult to configure. That's the drawback. So as soon as you know what to do and how to configure it, it's a very powerful tool, but you have to learn it, which is a big issue, and it's very slow as well. And there is a Tomcat tool, which is available both straight on the server if you want to use the deploy time conversion, but doesn't work really. Or if you want to use it on command line, it works better because you can configure the APIs you want to convert. So it's definitely better. The last part of this presentation is about how can I handle the transition period, because again, in your industry, in your company, there will be a transition period which is going to last for a couple of maybe weeks, months, or years, where basically you're gonna have to update your common libraries. You're gonna have to be running in parallel Javax versions and Jakarta versions, and then the question is, how do I share my dependencies? How do I decrease the pain? Because I don't want to be maintaining both Javax and Jakarta versions. Again, I've using open source projects, I've so far seen 3 different approaches. Some of them are better than the others, so I wanted to just share with you what I've used and what I've seen in the open source projects I've used. The first approach and the worst is using Maven classifiers. It works for simple cases, and when I say simple cases, it's really just a utility library without any dependency. It may work because basically it consists, I was talking about Apache Johnson. It consists of having the Maven Shade plugin in your project, and at build time, you're gonna be generating 2 jars. You publish that to Maven, and then whenever you want to use the Jakarta one, you just specify the classifier, right? Um, it works fine for simple cases, but it breaks everything. Like the IDEs won't be able to match the source code, the Java doc with the bytecode, because obviously it's different. It breaks all the transitive dependencies because if you convert Johnson core, which depends on an API, and you do not exclude the API to include the new one, then it breaks everything. And of course, when you use multi-module projects, then it becomes really cumbersome because you have to redo all the dependency management in your project. So it's really not the best approach. I have a couple of examples. I don't know if how much time do I have? 28 minutes. Okay, I'll show that maybe at the end of the presentation. The second approach I've seen so far, I think it was in Orkilian from the Red Hat team. They used another artifact ID with -Jakarta at the end because they were maintaining both Jakarta and Jakarta version of the artifact. That's probably a better approach. At least it doesn't break the IDEs, and at least the project deals with transitive dependencies. It doesn't push you with the problem of handling the transitive dependencies and including new libraries. So I think it's a better approach. I don't like the fact that there is some technical aspects in the artifact ID name, like if we start adding Javax, Jakarta, and Spring and Quarkus into our artifact ID names, then it becomes really bad. We start having technical aspects in there. The other thing which I don't like with this approach is at some point Jakarta is going to be mainstream, right? So what should we do? Do we keep Jakarta for the end of the life? Do we remove Jakarta, but then the user gets confused because he doesn't know if it's a Javax based jar or if it's a Jakarta compatible jar, and therefore you might have to redo everything that you have done previously and basically deconstruct all the previous changes. The last one I've seen, which is basically the best one, I think, is to use the major version. That's why they are 4, right? But yeah, it makes sense, but that probably is the less used approach in the open source projects, which is a bit crazy. In my opinion, this is the best one because, well, it doesn't have any of the previous issues. So whenever Jakarta becomes mainstream, you just have to upgrade the version, everything goes well. The only small thing that I faced, which is a bit fun, but if you are using GitHub with dependent-abort, it may ask you to upgrade to a version which is not compatible with your project because obviously you may have a Jakarta jar into your Javax project, etc. So you have to be careful with that. And I think that's it for this. I'm gonna show you a few examples maybe. Yeah, those are the two options we had at Jakarta, and well, I'm glad we've picked up the first one, and therefore we have to cope with the conversion only once, and then we can move on with our lives. Because if we had to do that for many years, it would be a nightmare. I've been working, for example, with Apache Tommy for a couple of years now. After publishing Jakarta E9 and Jakarta E10, I worked on the open source side to implement all the specifications like JAX-RS, JSON-P, etc. So I had to deal with all this garbage for quite a long time, for almost a year, and it was really a nightmare. So I'm glad now it's done and I can move on with implementing new features and new specifications as opposed to having to deal with that forever. So I'm glad our users and you as consumers in your companies, you also have to do that only once and not forever. I have a few examples, unless you have questions, of jar files. Let me see if I can move that. There we go. Well, those are, for example, some CVs on Tomcat 9. I was talking about some of the CVs. Here are the Tomcat 9 CVs. Some of them are very critical, as you can see. It's probably too small for you to read, but here are a couple of them you can see over here. Let's increase this as well. This is, I mentioned the Eclipse transformer. This is an example on how do you configure the Eclipse transformer. So you have to create those kinds of property files. So, well, I mentioned that it's very flexible and powerful, but it's also very tricky to configure, especially if you start looking at the end of the property file. Well, it works, but man, it's a bit hard. What else? What else do I have over here? Yeah, this is how you would configure the Eclipse transformer. Not so interesting. Let's move on. Yeah, this is an example of when the shading approach works well. So Commons DBCP is a connection pool for databases. Okay, Siri. Thanks. So it works pretty well because Commons DBCP doesn't have like any Javax dependencies, so you don't have to exclude or do anything else. You know, just have to include the regular dependencies. You know, have the shade plugin in there, and then you are done, really. When I mentioned that sometimes, where's my mouse? Might be this one. How much time do I have? 2 minutes. 2 minutes, okay. Let's move on to... so this is an example of the way you would shade with other dependencies. So if you don't want to break the dependencies, you have to create a module where basically you replicate all the dependencies but picking up the right ones with Jakarta. And then you shade all the jar files over here, and then you end up by having a new dependency which has the right dependencies, transitive dependencies in there, but you don't have to exclude all the other all the time. And I think that's it really. I can show you some examples outside if you want to. Just a funny thing, the Red Hat guys just they had a very smart and clever way to handle Javax in parallel of Jakarta using a small script like this. So they are using grep-sed and also some Maven commands. So this is a fun approach that allows them to basically have mainstream on Javax and have a Jakarta version as well. That's it. Thanks everyone for coming, and I hope it was at least useful for you.